afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Spilling Tea. I am your host, Tiffany Daniels, and folks, today, again, we're going back to that wonderful world of the JRC. Today, we are talking about, this comes from the autistic community and neurodiversity movement excerpt. And it is coming from the book. Oh, no, yeah, that's the name of the book. Anyways, we're going over something by Shane Nuremeier, who we've read from before, and Lydia X.Z. Brown. And it is called, folks, Torture in the Name of Treatment. The mission to stop the shocks in the age of deinstitutionalization. So the deinstitutionalization movement got started in the early 2000s, and it really coincided with the Stop the Shocks campaign. I was actually a part here in my state of one of the side products of that was the Employment First initiative that got kicked off here in about early 2008, late 2008, early 2009. Where we got that pushed through both our Congress and Senate here out in Missouri, where we focused on setting up things for transition age people with disabilities, where they can go on to employment or higher education, as opposed to immediately slamming them on Social Security, Medicaid, and sticking them in a group home. So that was a part of all of that. I'll give you some background some other day. But anyways, we are going to go ahead and read this here for today. As autistic activists Shane M. Nuremeier and Lydia X.Z. Brown have been working too close to the Judge Rotenberg Center in the U.S., which has engaged in some of the most egregious forms of such abuse, and more generally to the end of use of coercive and abusive forms of treatment for autistic and other disabled people for the past 10 years. Oh, it's been a lot longer than that, but whatever. You all just noticed us after the Judge Rotenberg Center is what happened. But neither here nor there. During that time, both of them have worked toward this goal through multiple avenues, including policy and legal advocacy, grassroots organizing, and media outreach. They believe that the neurodiversity movement's history is rife with instances of individual and systemic abuse, violence, and trauma, which they have been focused on naming and ending. They're not saying anything. They're stating fact, folks. It's all there for the world to read. I hate when they say, honey, would you like to see my files? God, I don't think I could even get that much out of my cloud. But go off. Anyways, sorry. Now, this article was written on the behalf of for Silverio Gonzalez, Abigail Gibson, Linda Cornelison, Vincent Militic, Danny Oswald, Robert Cooper, and unknown others broken down and killed at the Judge Rotenberg Center and inside institutions everywhere. You are not forgotten, and your lives were worth living. Amen. Amen. Remember their names. Anyways, so this is a little bit of an excerpt from something that we've already read, but it's worth mentioning again. Half an hour's drive south of Boston sits a facility that the United Nations has specifically condemned for its use of torture, and that the Massachusetts' own state agency for people with developmental disabilities described as inhumane beyond all reason. It isn't a historical site, kept intact as a memorial for its victims and a warning for the future. Nor is it an illegal operation that survived through secrecy and corruption. I will say it survived through secrecy and corruption, but unfortunately, they've let it be legal. Instead, the Judge Rotenberg Center, a self-described residential school and treatment center, continues to use an inhumane behavioralist approach in working with youth and adults with disabilities, as it has for over 45 years, the open complicity and funding from Massachusetts, New York, California, and several other states across the country. The Judge Rotenberg's most infamous form of abuse is electric shock, a human dog shock collar in the form of a backpack, and about one-fifth of its residents are forced to carry around with them throughout the day. Despite singular attention given to this particular aspect of its program, though the facility has been open for almost 2 decades before it started electrocuting people in its care. Both its origins and its practices during that initial period made it clear that the device itself wasn't what had made the program particularly bad. Rather, if any facility were to become the only one in the country, maybe even the world, to punish autistic and other disabled people with electric shock, it would be hardly surprising for it to be the one started by Matthew Israel, a protege of the infamous behaviorist B.F. Skinner, who wanted to bring his mentor's fictional behaviorist utopia, Walden 2, to life, but needed a captive audience to do it, and one which had already killed multiple residents through abuse and neglect before. The general public only became aware of and briefly galvanized in opposing JRC upon seeing footage, finally made public in April 2012, of a young man named Andre McCollins being repeatedly shocked while restrained face down, and this after numerous other immediate exposés of the practice in the decades since the JRC's founding. Autistic self-advocates and disability rights advocates more generally have been aware of and have actively trying to shut the program down for much longer. Our opposition goes beyond the program's egregious practices in and of themselves. State agencies, state legislators, courts, the federal government, and organizations such as Autism Speaks that claim to support us have all either refused to take a meaningful stand against the JRC, its philosophy, and its practices, or have actively protected or promoted them, like ABA International, for example. This speaks not only to how difficult a task it has been and will be to shut down this one alleged outlier, but to how little members of our community are valued, and therefore how significant the barriers and dangers are, or are likely to be, in other areas of advocacy. Tearing down the walls they built. Placements of confinement like residential schools, group homes, mental hospitals, and prisons have always sought people considered weird, scary, and subversive to keep inside their walls since their advent. Our history in the autistic self-advocacy and disability, more generally, is riddled with institutions which we know as places of constant violence, forced treatment, involuntary medical experimentation, isolation, and layers upon layers of abuse, even and especially ones that seem nice on the outside. There were the Fernald radiation experiments, where researchers recruited institutionalized disabled children for a science club so they can investigate the effects of radiation by feeding them eradicated cereal without their knowledge. There were the Tuskegee experiments, where researchers deliberately withheld treatment from low-income black workers with syphilis so they could study the course of the disease. There were the developmentally disabled men confined in a bunkhouse in Iowa and forced to work for decades in a turkey slaughter factory for a sub-minimum wage. And there were the Willowbanks and Pennhurst, large-scale state-run institutions where thousands of people with disabilities were incarcerated in squalor and subject to live to all manner of abuses. The history of prisons as places of confinement is old and dark, and the distinction between disability institutions, places that are supposed to provide care, and penal institutions, places that are supposed to detain and punish, constantly blurring until it's hard to tell much of a difference. Ableism is the idea that only some people's brains or bodies are healthy, whole, functional, and valuable in society, and that the rest of us are broken, defective, inferior, and unworthy. And that's what we're treated like, all day, every day, especially by the medical community. Put into practice, ableism values us based on whether we seem normal based on constantly shifting goalposts, whether we work and produce according to conventional measures, and whether we maintain the social order in a profoundly racist and classist society. JRCs and institutions like it operate knowing that most people will readily accept myths about disabled people's incompetence, inferiority, and brokenness. Hollywood and everyone else beat it into us every day, whether it's through inspiration porn or whether it's through something more deliberate, like those goddamn autism speak ads. It's easier to dismiss us as uncontrollable, violent, and aggressive for no reason than to recognize that many of us have survived years of trauma caused by compliance training, rejection, isolation, and serial predators. It's easier to believe that non disabled family members and experts know what it is best for disabled people than to believe us speaking for ourselves. It's easier to lock us away instead of doing the work necessary to make sure we can all belong and exercise autonomy. At JRC, fear, revulsion, pity, and hatred pervade the place so strongly that torture can be resold as extremely beneficial and life saving treatment that allows JRC residents to integrate into the community, which is an Americans with Disabilities Act requirement. JRC abuses represent some of the most extreme forms of behaviorist violence. Yet, as a community pioneer, Mel Baggs has observed repeatedly over the past decades, JRC is not the worst institution to ever existed, but rather represents thousands of institutions where staff can abuse, torture, and murder disabled people with impunity and in silence. An institution may be as small as a single person, Baggs has written, so long as that person lives under the control of others. Survivors of institutionalization outside JRC, including both Baggs and activist commentator Cal Montgomery, often describe aesthetically pleasing and seemingly progressive institutions as the most dangerous. In this, the JRC's threat becomes clearer. Disguised by flashy and bright big reward store and yellow brick road rooms, clean and pressed shirts and ties for residents, and newly painted group homes in the neighborhood surrounding the main building. Worse, the JRC's marketing model, holding out its stimulatingly decorated rooms as proof of its benevolence, ironically ignores that a large portion of the people confined there are much more likely to be overwhelmed and overstimulated, sometimes even to the point of physical pain, by the design of these rooms. Thank you. Non-autistic people, and especially neurotypical people, also seem woefully unaware of these particular issues, despite the increase in autism awareness campaigns of the last several years. Thank you. JRC has also been an atypical private institution. Its largely negatively racialized population and its constant domineering surveillance over both residents and staff. Over the past 5 decades, JRC's population has shifted. Its residents were once almost entirely people with developmental disabilities with intense support needs. Now its residents include large numbers of people whose primary neurodivergence is psychiatric disability or mental illness, many whom arrive through referrals from the juvenile criminal legal system. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, in the 2015-2016 school year, JRC's school-age population was 81.5% Black or Latinx people, with all categories of people of color or racial minorities combined comprising 87.4% of its population. The particular blend of ableist and racist targeting challenges the historically white autistic community and neurodiversity movement by calling into question how and why so many activists working publicly against the JRC have little to no understanding of the racial implications of the JRC's population, increasing overt ties to the criminal punishment system, including transfers from Rikers Island. Furthermore, those committed to anti-racism work, particularly our white and non-disabled allies, must also contend with JRC's exploitation and scapegoating of low-paid line workers, who are largely immigrants of color, and often the only JRC staff ever prosecuted for physical abuse. But never to shocks. While the largely white administration avoids any meaningful consequences, JRC, like all institutions, is the inevitable product of a society of prisons, which exists as a tool of a social control for eradicating undesirable people and enabling appalling abuses as punishment, treatment, or both on those powerless to stop them from happening. In recent years, National ADAPT, a grassroots direct action disability rights group, consisted primarily of anti-institutionalization, physically disabled activists, has organized multiple actions targeting the JRC both in Massachusetts and in Washington, D.C. ADAPT's anti-JRC work has been led in large by the wisdom of several autistic leaders, including Anita Cameron, a proudly queer Black activist who has been organizing with ADAPT for decades, and Cal Montgomery, longtime autistic writer and activist, who's also a survivor of multiple institutions. And while we haven't been able to participate in most of ADAPT's actions, we have supported and amplified their efforts in every way possible. Now, the fight against the JRC is firmly in the cross-disability community's arena, and no longer the sole dominion of the small but mighty autistic self-advocacy movement, where generations of neurodiversity advocates have supported one another in fighting it. More promisingly, younger activists and advocates are now joining forces to renew the struggle against the JRC and similar sites of violence, following in decades of work to tear down the institution walls. All right, we'll get more into it probably tomorrow, but this is a pretty good idea how things started, how we all got involved. Some of them have been involved going all the way back to about around 1994. I came in about around 2008, 2009. So I've been in it now for about 13 plus years, which is about the same time with Lydia Shane Ari also got involved with it as well. We kind of became a massive group right around then, and we were definitely ones who were pushing and putting on the pressure to get that tape of what happened to Andre McCollins released. But this kind of goes into not just the JRC, but I've alluded to it before in my videos, folks. Although the JRC is the most well known for it because of that video in 2012 that I've shown you all on this channel, but it's by far not the only school that engages in such things. We have heard of deaths of improper restraints. We've heard deaths of that they call accidents that when you look into them aren't really accidents at all. We hear about people in communities who have actually chained disabled people to radiators while pocketing their Social Security money. This isn't a joke, folks. Yes, I will go after the JRC forever, but I haven't forgotten the other problems either. It's an ableist world out there, and it is dangerous for people with disabilities. And I will fight every day until it no longer is. I will work until I am no longer stared at, sneered at, or condescended down to when all I'm trying to do is go grocery shopping. All right, folks. That's all I've got for this afternoon. Now, as always, folks, we don't get very many views on this channel. The few that we do tend to get removed time to time, so please don't forget to hit that like button. Hit subscribe. Don't forget to hit the comments. I do appreciate your time this afternoon. And as always, folks, we here at Smelling Tea hope you have a good one. Bye-bye.